Okay, so here we're going to talk about climate and biomes. A couple things to remember. Earth is made up of several different types of regional ecosystems that share common animal life and vegetation and are determined by climatic conditions. So a biome is a regional ecosystem shares common animal life and vegetation. And it is determined by climatic conditions, specifically temperature and precipitation. Again, Earth's biomes are determined by temperature and precipitation. Areas with high precip tend to have forests. Lower precip doesn't necessarily give you the growth of trees, so it's going to develop grasslands, tundras, deserts, things like that. Here you can see a figure from your book on page 153. It's the distribution of biomes across the globe. Each of them are characterized by a certain combination of climate and dominant vegetation. And that dominant vegetation does result primarily from differences in climate. Each biome contains many different ecosystems whose communities have adapted to differences in climate, soil, and other environmental factors. People have removed or altered much of the natural vegetation in some areas for farming, for livestock grazing, for obtaining timber and fuel wood, for mining, for the construction of towns and cities. So something to think about: if you take away human influences like farming and urban development, what kind of biome do we live in? As you can see here, the entire eastern seaboard, except for a little bit of a temperate rainforest area, we are most decidedly temperate deciduous forest. So a number of things are going to influence biome distribution. Obviously, latitude is going to influence biome distribution, and obviously altitude, and in terms temperature, it's going to influence biome distribution. So the things that we are going to talk about of the next couple of slides is how does latitude influence biome distribution, and then the next slide we're going to talk about a little bit of altitude, as well as just kind of overall temperature as you go north from the equator. So here we got elevation, here's altitude. All right, over here on the left-hand side, as you go up in altitude, obviously you're going to get, mountain ice and snow. Coniferous forests are going to be higher up in altitude. Tropical forests will tend to be lower in altitude, and deciduous forests would be somewhat in between. But as we go from here being the equator, and here being the North Pole, we are going to see different types of biomes distributed. We've got tropical forests leading into deciduous forests, coniferous forests, and then we've got our tundra here, where I just mentioned before, here you see no trees. Okay? Too cold, not enough liquid precipitation. Here's another figure from your book. This is biome distribution. And really, it's demonstrating really that average precipitation and average temperature acting together as limiting factors over a long time help to determine the type of desert, grassland, or forest in a particular area, and the types of plants, animals, and decomposers found in that area. So as we go from over here on the right to over here on the left, we're going from a very dry climate over here to a very wet climate. And as we go from here on the bottom up to the top, we're going from a very hot climate to a cold climate. So combinations of hot climate and dry. Here you've got a tropical desert. Okay, moving into a tropical grassland. All right, here we're increasing precipitation as we go from right to left. Here is pretty much where we are. So we live in a relatively mild climate, and we actually get quite a bit of precipitation. So we are in a temperate deciduous forest. But here we get into some chaparral, which is, we'll talk about later on. Here is a temperate grassland. We actually see this, and to some extent this, a temperate desert, here in our country. Then we get up further north. Obviously, you can consider this to almost be like, the equator. This up here kind of being like the North Pole. So as we continue to go north, we'll see more evergreen coniferous forests and cold deserts. You'll see some cold deserts in areas of China. And then obviously we get up into some Arctic tundra as we finish up our trip north. So let's talk about some deserts. There are 3 different types of deserts. As you can see over here on the right-hand side of the screen, we do see some temperature graphs for tropical deserts, temperate deserts, and cold deserts. The climate graphs track the typical variations in annual temperature, which is red, and the precipitation, which is blue down on the bottom, in tropical, temperate, and cold deserts. So a tropical desert in the UAE, which is the picture up on top, where you see a sport utility vehicle participating in a popular but very destructive SUV rodeo. In the center photo, we've got a temperate desert. This is southeastern California with a type of cactus. And then the bottom photo is a cold desert, which is in Mongolia. That's the Gobi Desert, where these Bactrian camels live. So notice that a month of the year that has the highest temperatures here in July. Okay, and notice the main difference between the tropical desert and the cold desert is you get these extremes, January to December. Here you don't see, this is a lower range, and here is a greater range. But as we go north here, you'll notice that there is actually greater precipitation in the cold deserts than there are here in the tropical deserts. Some things that you need to worry about with regard to natural capital degradation in deserts. You've got to worry about large desert cities being constructed in areas like the UAE, in areas like the Sahara Desert. You create these large desert cities, that's certainly something that will have a human impact on the ecosystems. We saw on the former picture, you've got soil destruction by vehicles, like off-road vehicles. You'll get soil salinization. So you're increasing the salt content of the soil because of irrigation. You are depleting groundwater. And you've got pollution and mineral extraction, which is going to disturb the land. So these are some natural capital degradation things that take place in deserts. Let's see, we'll move on here. And we'll start talking about grasslands. All right, so grasslands, these areas are typically found in the middle latitudes. They're characterized by a lack of any real type of closed canopy from woody trees. Most of the vegetation is grasses and flowers. You got some shrubs, you got a few trees. Vegetation is limited to fast-growing plants because of the lack of rainfall in a very short growing season. Then you usually have lots of naturally occurring fires. Summers tend to be warm and humid. Winters are cold and dry. Soils tend to be thick. They're very rich in nutrients. When cleared, grasslands actually make really good farmland. They tend to be found in the interiors of continents, and they tend to be named according to geographic location. So what we're looking at here is we're looking at a couple of different types of grasslands, as can be found in your book. And each of these, again, is based upon the type of climate you're seeing. So again, look up at the top, the tropical grassland, which is a savanna. The top photo is in Kenya. The center photo is in East Glacier Park in Montana. And the bottom photo is in Alaska. So again, we're seeing these major extremes. In the tropical grassland, we see higher precipitation values more in the wintertime than we do in the summer months. The temperate grassland, which you can think about as being in the center of our country, you see low extremes in the winter months in terms of temperature and precipitation, and the precipitation goes ahead and increases as you go towards the summer months, along with temperature. Whereas in the cold grassland, in the Arctic tundra, you see temperature extremes from January to December, peaking in the middle of the summer months, but it tends to be pretty consistent with regard to precipitation throughout the year. So some natural capital degradation dealing with grasslands is obviously the conversion to cropland, obviously, clearing and using that area for agricultural purposes. You got the release of CO2 because of burning grasslands. You've got potential for overgrazing. And then you also have in the Arctic tundra, in the areas of grasslands, and this is particularly in the ANWR, the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, you've got oil production. So everything that goes along with drilling and mining oil, and the vehicles that need to go there to mine that oil, to drill for that oil, all of that stuff is a human impact on grasslands as well. Wetlands. Wetlands are areas that are at least partially flooded during part of their annual cycle. Many remain flooded year-round, while others are dry for just a portion of the year. Plant life in wetlands has to be adapted to moist conditions and includes species like lilies, cattails, gum trees, things like that. There's a really high biodiversity of animals, lots of species of amphibians and reptiles. There's lots of ducks, wading birds, mammals like beavers and minks. The water could be fresh, like swamps, bogs. They could be salty, like salt marshes or mangrove forests, or it could be a mixture of the two, which is an estuary, which we'll talk about here in a minute. Wetlands are very, very important because they are very rich in nutrients. And they really serve as they're a breeding and nesting ground. For lots of ecologically as well as economically important species of birds, fish, shellfish, and so on. So wetlands are really, really important. They do, as you can see in the diagram here, some things over on this side are some environmental benefits. You see reducing flooding and erosion. Again, here, improving water quality. If you remember the TED Talk that we watched earlier in the year, where the guy was talking about the fish farm, that's basically a wetland, and it actually improves water quality. It's a reduction of flooding and erosion. You've got habitat for wildlife, and again, it becomes this really great breeding and nesting ground for those fish, as well as some of those predators that came into that wetland in Spain. Chapparal. Chapparal is an arid shrubland. They're really most notable for their ability and their tendency to be shaped by fire. Chapparal landscape is really, we see it all the time in movie westerns. You got flat, rocky plains, you have mountain slopes. Things about Chapparal, very low rainfall. They're really often found in the zones between deserts and grasslands. The climate can often be called Mediterranean. Simply because it's hot and dry most of the year. Years that you have increased rainfall, fires really are actually more common simply because you have increased plant growth, which then dries out and then acts as kindling for fires once the rainfall stops. One of the main things about chaparrals is that there's been a lot of controversy about the effect of human fire suppression, with most people believing that it actually just increases the possibility of severe fires later because you're building up biomass that will act as kindling later on. Plants and animals in chaparral are actually adapted for conserving moisture. So reptiles, Lots of reptiles. They have thick-scaled skin. Mammals in this area tend to be nocturnal. Plants you find are like cactus and yucca and the creosote bush. They have really hard, thick leaves. In the U.S., you got California, where you've got Chapparal, the Mediterranean coast of Europe, the Western Cape of South Africa, parts of southwestern Australia is where you can find this ecosystem, this biome. Tundra, it's the coldest biome. They can either be at the far north latitudes or at high elevations. The far north latitudes are known as the Arctic tundra. High altitudes is alpine tundra. So here we're dealing with year-round cold and dry conditions, low growing vegetation, very short growing season, and really low biodiversity. The growing season is really short, 50 to 60 days. And there's low precipitation, so less than 10 inches a year. Plants are really slow to grow. They're very fragile. They're very slow to recover from any damage that takes place. Some animal species you can find in the Arctic tundra. You got the Arctic fox, ground squirrel, caribou. In the alpine tundra, you got lots of mountain goats. So let's talk about estuaries. An estuary is usually found at the mouth of a river where it drains into a sea. An estuary is a partially enclosed body of water that contains a mix of salt and fresh water. If you're thinking about an estuary in the United States, really the one that comes to the forefront in terms of environmental thinking and is actually right in our own backyard is Chesapeake Bay. So this graphic right here actually shows some things that can actually help to destroy estuaries upstream where the tide, when it says where the tide meets the river. And then here we've got down here things that take place closer to the ocean end, and then some environmental good things and bad things here in the estuary itself. Okay, let's talk forests. There are three major types of forests. So we see here the climate graphs. Here we're tracking the typical variations in annual temperature. Again, red, precip, blue, in tropical, temperate, and cold forests. So we see a closed canopy on top of the tropical rainforest in Africa. The middle forest is a temperate deciduous forest in Rhode Island during the fall. And the bottom photo is a northern coniferous forest in Canada. It's Jasper National Park. So let's look at forests real quick. So when we talk about temperate deciduous forests, they are found, so this forest right here, they are found in the middle latitudes, between the poles and the tropics. So we're talking about 30 to 60 inches of rainfall every year. They've got 4 distinct seasons, really determined by changes in temperature. So spring, summer, fall, and winter, prone to frost and snow during the wintertime. So you've got broadleaf hardwood trees, you've got oaks, maple, hickory. It's got low-lying shrubs, rhododendrons, azaleas, and then it's got a array of shade-tolerant plants, ground mosses, lichens, things like that. Because of the autumn leaf fall and the decomposing leaf litter, soils are really, really well developed. They're very rich in nutrients. Some notable species that are in temperate deciduous forests: squirrels, deer, black bear, bobcat, birds, all kinds of birds, cardinals, chickadees, hawks, blackbirds, things like that. Again, locations that you can find them: the eastern U.S., Central Europe, places in East Asia, the southern tip of South America, New Zealand, southeastern Australia. Let's talk now about the boreal forest. So it's in a broad belt across the northern latitudes between 50 and 60 degrees north latitude. Some defining characteristics. So you got 12 to 35 inches of rain every year, mostly in the form of snow and sleet. Long, dry winters, short, moderately warm, wet summers, growing season about 130 days. Really short growing season, so the trees are evergreen. Okay, tree species include spruce, pines, firs. There's very little understory vegetation. The soils are very thin, they're acidic, they're very nutrient poor. Animals that you'll find here are moose, grizzly bear, weasels, birds like eagles, hawks. So the locations that you'll find them include a broad band across the northern latitudes of North America, especially Canada and Alaska. You'll find them in northern Russia, and you'll find them in Scandinavia. So let's talk a little bit about natural capital degradation here with forests. And I'll try and focus more on some of the temperate things. But really, I mean, with forests, the degradation is really all the same. One of the things that you really have to worry about with forest is obviously deforestation, which is clearing for agriculture, for grazing, for development, for timber. And then after this deforestation takes place, then you also have the conversion from this diverse forest to a tree plantation. So an example of this would be coming into an old growth forest like the one we see here, cutting these down, and then actually replanting. So you're dealing with some secondary succession. And that secondary succession then is dominated by fast-growing trees that can be harvested again for lumber. And then another thing that can affect forests is pollution into forest streams. That stream water actually gets down into the groundwater, affects the root system of the trees, and can eventually destroy that ecosystem. All right, let's talk about tropical rainforests. I kind of held off on this one for a little while because I really wanted to talk about this one a little bit further. They're found mostly between 25 north and 25 degrees south of the equator. Lots of rainfall, lots of rainfall. But you only really have two seasons. The two seasons are basically one wet, one tends to be dry, okay? Quote unquote dry, because you're still getting the rainfall. And the reason that you break it down into wet and dry is because you've got year-long warm weather. The plants really tend to be broad-leafed. They're evergreen. Even though the rainforests contain Earth's highest biodiversity, which, I mean, you look at this intertangled web here, and the amount of biodiversity that's going on in this ecosystem is immense. Their soils really are nutrient poor. It's unsuitable for farmland if the forest is cleared. And that's one of the things that people get into, and it's a trap that people get into when they think about, man, you look at all this biodiversity, look at all the plant life and the tree life that's growing in this place. If we were to clear it, imagine what we could do in terms of agriculture. Well, the soils really aren't that thick because each portion of this entire web winds up feeding off of each other rather than from the stuff underneath it. Lots of notable species, parrots, wide variety of other brightly colored birds, large snakes, monkeys, lemurs, orchids, fig trees. Your locations, Central America and South America along the Amazon, primarily in Brazil, in Africa, along the Atlantic West African coast, from Liberia all the way around to Congo and into Central Africa, the island of Madagascar. You have in Asia, you've got Indonesia and Malaysia, you've got the west coast of India, Papua New Guinea, parts of Australia as well. So let's take a look at this, this web that you see. It does show some of the components and interactions in a tropical rainforest. When these organisms die, the decomposers break down their organic matter into minerals that the plants use. So the colored arrows actually indicate transfers of matter and energy between producers, primary consumers, which again are the herbivores, secondary or higher level consumers, carnivores, and decomposers. So really, all of these nutrients wind up, again, cycling back and forth within one another. So it doesn't necessarily get itself down to provide nutrients into the soil, which is a reason why your tropical rainforest soils aren't as developed. They aren't very nutrient rich because, again, all of these things wind up feeding off of each other. Here's a diagram that shows the different layers of a tropical rainforest. And when we talk about layers, we're talking about stratification. And within each part of these layers, you get specialized species. And each of these layers, again, if you remember when we started talking about ecosystems before, is a specialized niche. Okay, so you have these eagles that specialize in this upper level canopy. Okay, you have the toucan, which specializes in this level. All right, this woolly opossum specializes here. Okay, you got the tapirs, and you have other birds that live on the forest floor. Okay, so they specialize in each one of these areas. Okay, and fortunately, because they're so specialized, it leads to, each of these niches leads to coexistence. Almost a sense of resource partitioning. And all of these things together lead to a maximum in biodiversity. All right, and then finally what we'll do is we're going to talk about mountains. The mountains do play an important ecological roles. Some things that you have to worry about in terms of degrading the land in mountains. You have to worry about the development of agriculture. You've got to worry about timber and mineral extraction. You have to worry about dams and the creation of reservoirs. Obviously, with it being as beautiful as it is, you're going to see increased tourism, which just leads to more human interaction with the ecosystem itself. With any place air pollution comes in from urban areas and from power plants, soil damage from off-road vehicles, and then you also have water supplies being threatened because of the possibility of glacial melting. All right, so that's it. Expect some free response questions on Thursday, March 19th. There'll probably be 2 free response questions that you'll have to work on, and then you'll watch episode 1 of season 3 of the HBO documentary series Vice. That's actually going to take a look at melting in both western and eastern Antarctica. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me. I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Thanks so much. Have a good one.